Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day as we continue to celebrate all the amazing people who are making Mississippi such a great place to live, work, and play. It's Thursday on the show as we continue to roll out to the rest of the state. And so I want to welcome our friends from the Jackson metro area and the Mississippi Delta, along with the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Hey, listen, last Thursday we had a terrific show with the Speaker of the House, Jason White. We got to find out a lot about what makes him tick. We didn't really get into a lot of the issues. We talked about issues to some extent, but really it was about understanding where he comes from, his time in Kosciuszko and now, of course, in West Mississippi, and his time as a judge and a city lawyer and learning in the trenches, being involved in the community and continuing to learn in the trenches, and how that really prepared him well to be Speaker of the House. His first, of course, in the legislature, then becoming Speaker of the House. But it was a terrific conversation. If you missed it, you can go to the Ricky Matthews Show on your favorite podcast platform, or go to Facebook or YouTube and look it up. I think you'll be glad you did. We learned a little bit more about what's going on in Jason White's life, sort of behind the headlines. That's one of the great things about having a show like this. We can dive a little bit deeper. Today's a similar kind of show. We're going to have a coast legislator, Senator Brice Wiggins, who is a senator from District 52 in Jackson County. Someone who's been on the show several times. We've told his story, but he's also you hear his name a lot because he's involved in a lot of the weighty issues in our state. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to join him, have him join us, not just to talk about what's in it for coastal Mississippi, but his leadership role in some really, really weighty issues and what they mean to Mississippi. Without any further ado, let me welcome Senator Brice Wiggins, back to the Ricky Matthews Show. How you doing, Brice?
Hey, Ricky, doing great. Thank you very much for having me. I wanted to say about Speaker White. So we were actually in the same law school class and at Mississippi College School of Law. Jason's a great person. I thought going into this most recent session, he was perfect for that position. Have a really good relationship. We butt heads because we're on different sides of the Capitol, but I have nothing but a ton of respect for him and his legislative, I guess you'd call it chops. And so I'd encourage people to listen because I think Jason is certainly a hard worker, but has a lot on the ball.
It was really a fantastic conversation. You know, one of the things that he talked about was the need to communicate and the need to get to know fellow legislators, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And he said essentially it's hard to be mad at somebody that you know. You know, it's not hard. I just think that's such a smart thing to say. But if you go back and look in his past, his work on the ground helped him recognize the importance of perspective. I don't find your story to be a whole lot different because you were a DA. You know in your law practice you're involved in local legal system, but you think about your time as a DA, you really have to get into the heart and soul of a community to do that job, and you learn a lot, don't you?
You do, but your point about, I guess what Speaker White said, it's hard to be mad at somebody when you see him every day, and that's what you are when you're in the DA's office. You're dealing with people who, depending on the case, are at that worst, and then you see the highs when you get closure. There's a saying, I practice law with my firm Taggart, Rhines & Wiggins. There's a saying in circuit court, it's the place where bad people are on their best behavior. In Chancery Court, which is your divorces and things like that, are good people on their worst behavior because it's so emotional on that. In circuit court, that's where your criminals are, and you have that. So, but you have victims, and you're dealing. Every victim, that's why they're a victim. And it may be a burglary, it may be a murder, it may be something. And you're dealing with the human condition and the human emotions. And I do think for so many instances that gets lost. And it really is, it brings you face to face with humanity. And I think Jason is in that, being a practicing lawyer. I know lawyers get a bad rap, but you're dealing with your fellow person in the human condition, I'll call it, and it's good.
Well, I mean, like you, before he became a legislator, he was involved in sort of local government. He was an alderman in the city of West, only 250 people. His mother-in-law was the mayor. So, I mean, just imagine, how that could create some conflict along the way. And he said he survived it. And
well, I have respect for those guys because, look, they're getting phone calls about the ditch and the neighbor's dog and things like that. I will say, being a state senator, you don't necessarily get those calls. So kudos to those folks.
Well, hey, speaking of that, incidentally, he told the story of a guy who came in complaining about a barking dog. And I think it might have even been a relative or something. But anyway, he said he put the cassette player up on the table and actually played the recording of the dog barking. And he said, we sort of chuckled a bit to say that the further you go up in sort of your public service, in his case, the legislature and then the House of Representatives speaker, you still have dogs. They bark a little louder. They might bite a little bit harder, but it's similar. But you can relate to that from having been a DA, assistant DA, can't you?
Yes, and that person who brought the dog in and they had to do that, Jason, in that case, probably saw that person at church on Sunday or something like that, or in the grocery store on a Friday or Saturday. And that's the thing is you have a role, be it alderman or prosecutor or whatever, but then you see that person on a regular basis while you're shopping for your groceries. But that's what I think our founders set this up, how they set it up, and it's great. But back on the DA side of it, yes, I was there. Ricky, the last case I prosecuted before I decided to run for the Senate involved a murder case where a grandfather came down from Hattiesburg to see his grandson play football. Took a wrong turn at what we called the Conoco station in Moss Point, and 5 juveniles actually jumped him and stole his wallet and killed him. And the kid, he was a kid that I prosecuted, was 15, 16 years old, and put him in prison for the rest of his life. And when you stand before a jury and you have a 15-year-old kid who's he deserved to go there. He killed this grandfather. It is something, and it informs your outlook on life. And it's not necessarily what you see on TV. These are real people. Interestingly, prior to that, I had a case where was prosecuting, I think it was for aggravated assault. And then at the same time, so the victims, you had the victims that we were working with. At the same time, one of the victims also had a criminal charge we were prosecuting. So you're there, but going back to the 16-year-old, I mean, I don't know how you can sit there and you can look at and say, this you can't get emotional, if you will. And this kid, when you go into the state prison system, your life has changed forever. Of course, they changed that grandfather's life when they killed him. And all he was doing, they just took they pulled into the Conoco station to ask for directions and lost his life. It's sad amongst other things. And that stays with me from the time I went into the Senate.
But listen, Brice, it gives you a perspective, and you continue to practice law today. All kinds of different law. You and your partners have built this great firm. I'm assuming, are you sitting in your office in Pascagoula now as we speak?
I am, and we have 4 offices: Ocean Springs, Ridgeland, and Hattiesburg as well. So yes.
Wow, that's really cool. Hey, while we're on it, tell us about your law firm.
Well, thank you. So the name partners are Jeff Rhines, myself, and Andy Taggart. And many people know Andy as I'm gonna show his age here, but he was head of the Republican Party. if you're in politics, then you know Andy Taggart, and he was more so than most anybody responsible for the state Republican Party. By the way, he just did a podcast with Empower Mississippi that I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on, you need to listen to it. Andy's knowledge is so valuable, but I didn't know this. He was head of the state Republican Party. I think it was in 1980. He had just come out of college, and that one thing led to another. So that's who it is, and we are all Jackson Countyans at heart, or that's where we got our start. But we merged about 3 years ago, my practice, and now it's Taggart, Rhymes, and Wiggins.
Well, listen, my son Jordan went to law school with Drew Taggart, and they remain friends. And Drew is one of the luckiest fishermen I've ever met. When he fishes with us, we have unbelievable days. Let me put it that way. I don't know what it is about Drew, but he's a lucky dude. Hey, when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Senator Brice Wiggins when we get back. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. We're visiting with Senator Brice Wiggins from down here on the coast, but he's got really important legislative responsibilities in the Senate. Appropriations Committee, Education Committee, Executive Contingent Fund Committee. He's the chair of Judiciary Division A Committee, Labor Committee, Ports and Marine Resources Committee, Public Health and Welfare Committee, and Tourism. And he has just other roles that he plays in the legislature. But listen, we'll get into some legislation here in just a second. But just generally, Brice, I watched this session closely, and I've talked to Delbert Hoseman about it here on the show, and then, of course, with the speaker last week. This was a session where, from the day you guys got there, you were engaged. Usually there's a bit of a lull at the beginning of the session. There was no lull this year, and the number of big issues that were tackled was off the charts, and you were kind of in the epicenter of most of these important conversations. But when you look back on this session, how do you think about it?
Actually, I think about it just how you described it. I've told people, I said, we launched in and decided to bite off the really big issues and all at one time, which is a difficult matter, but it needs to be done. I think the reason we did that is a number of reasons, or a number of reasons. One is it's the first year of a 4-year term, and so you've got new people, you've got engagement. Lieutenant Governor Hoseman, he was now in his second term, and so he had issues he wanted to tackle. I think also you're seeing the Republicans getting hold of things. And while Jason is a new speaker, he's been there in the trenches. In fact, probably 8 years ago, when I was chairman of Medicaid in the Senate, I worked on the opposite side of him in the House on Medicaid. So you have people who've been there, and so they know these things have to be taken on. I'm sure we'll talk about it, but PERS is, for one thing that I noticed is you're seeing your statewide leaders willing to talk about the issues that we have, when in the past, PERS was considered something, as they say, would take your picture off the wall because of the way it is. And I think what you're seeing is you've got leaders who are willing to tackle these issues. And by the way, if they were easy, they would have been solved a long time ago. And I believe that that's why people elect us to go to Jackson and to handle the issues. And to be quite honest, we do that and Congress doesn't. They're not tackling the issues that are important or that actually need to be tackled because they're afraid of losing their status or whatever. We can just talk immigration, borders one, but you have to roll up your sleeves and get in there. And I think that's what we did this session.
Well, I referred to it when I was talking with Speaker White. I referred to it as kind of strategic leadership. That PERS, for example, for people who don't know what that means, it's the state retirement program. And when you add up the number of people who were involved in employment with the state, And then you look at number of retirees, you're talking about a population of about 250,000 people. That's a big, big block of people that are on the program or will be on the program. And when you start to look at the long-term sort of financial implications of whether it's, our future obligations funded, it's troubling. And so too many in the past have said, let's kick that ball further down the road. And we decided this year we got to have the conversation. Same thing as it relates to healthcare and Medicaid expansion. We've said we're not going to have these conversations. And we're saying today, let's have the conversations. Let's understand how all of this works. You think about education funding for all these reasons that you're concerned about the state retirement program. Same thing is true for education. With people involved in the education system, they're loud and they're proud, and you hear from them. And you start talking about changing the formula, which we did this year. It's a big deal. But you guys really, and that's just, those are the three big issues people remember. But there are many others that fell underneath that. Some successful, some not. But it was a really, really busy session. We'll come back. Go ahead.
Two things on that.
Yeah.
So when you take on those things, every session, you try things, but you're not going to get the ball across the finish line every single time. But you've got to try, and we did that. And I think we did make accomplishments. But the big things we're going to take those on next year. On the PERS, the analogy I use, my daughter is in the teaching program at Ole Miss. She's a freshman, will be a sophomore. The analogy I used was when my daughter gets ready to retire, and the program she's in is to attract teachers in Mississippi, she won't have a retirement system if we keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And people, and that's whatever it is, 25, 30 years, let's say, but we can't continue to do that. My daughter, who's going to give her life to teaching, and she's not going to have a retirement because it's underfunded, one of the worst in the country. So those are the discussions we have to have.
Well, it's so, what's interesting is from one month to the next, from one session to the next, the conditions change. The situation is different. New leaders emerge. New information emerges. New experience emerges. Even on the national level, you think about what Trump has said in the past about ACA eliminating it. Today, he talks more about not eliminating it and enhancing it. So you just, you got it. What you have to do, you cannot say we're not going to have a conversation. You have to say, let's have a conversation based on what we know today. And based on the situation in Mississippi, which is different. And I think, we're having those conversations, and I applaud. I agree that having been a former newspaper publisher, I know better than most that some of the easiest legislations, for some reason, don't make it through. And some of the hardest legislation, stuff you never would have even thought could have a chance in hell of even making that a committee, gets signed into law by the governor. But oftentimes it takes 2 or 3 years to pull things together. And what you're doing in those discussions, as you debate, as new information emerges, as these things happen, people are getting more educated. They're getting a different perspective on what the problem is and why we have to address, or maybe we don't have to address, whatever the situation might be. And we get stronger as a state as a result of having those conversations. So I don't get frustrated when things don't result in a passed bill every time. No, sometimes I do, because some easy stuff that should fly through sometimes gets hung up, and that's unfortunate. But that's just kind of the nature of the beast, isn't it, Brice?
It is the nature of the beast. I think, to be honest, it's harder now with the advent of social media and all. It is easier to kill something than it is to pass. I think people with social media and all don't want to, if it's not their worldview, then by gosh, it's wrong. And that's a problem. The whole legislative process is, like you're saying, you have to understand where things are, and it can get complicated, and people need to understand it. But to your point, that's exactly what happened. We can talk about it, but the Medicaid, I was on the conference committee for the, whatever you want to call it, Medicaid expansion or bringing in health insurance to the working poor. And after the session, I heard people go, "Hey, Brice, I didn't know about all that. The plan that y'all actually had, oh, that's good. And I do think the conversation changed. And that's very important for when you get legislation. And a lot of times the first bill out of the chute is not the best thing. And you come back the next year, haven't heard it. Like, I'll take the Medicaid. People are going, oh, well, you know what? That actually sounded good. One of the things was the exchange, the state exchange. And people didn't know that existed, and now they did. And we were trying to preserve that and make it even more robust to help people. And they're like, hey, I could actually support that with the state exchange. And you come back and you do it the next year, or it may be the third year. So, yes, that's how that works.
Hey, listen, we'll come back and maybe talk specifics about some of the legislation if we have an opportunity to do that. But what's interesting to me is that usually what used to happen, and let's say before social media, before sort of the more polarizing political situation we're in today, that what would happen is sort of the national politics would play out and they would fight and do whatever they do from a polarizing perspective. But the state politics didn't tend to match up to that. You know, usually in the state, and I would say go back in history, certain issues would bring it out of us for sure. But I think if you were to look at the bills that passed in Mississippi, even today, the amount of bipartisan support on many of those bills would probably shock people, because what they see only is the polarizing ends that sometimes and too often, in my view, sort of match up with what's happening in national politics, sadly. When we come back on the other side, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what does conservatism mean to you today? What's the Republican Party mean to you today? How is the state situation different than what's playing out on the national front? We'll do all that when we get back on the other side as we continue our conversation with Senator Brice Wiggins from coastal Mississippi. He's a leader in the legislature. I think you'll enjoy the rest of the conversation. We'll see you when we get back. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. We have Senator Brice Wiggins with us today. And as I mentioned before we went to break, the political situation in America is much more dynamic today than it was even 10 years ago. What amazes me, and I say this on the show a lot, Brice, is that when we think about sort of where we are, especially as it relates to digital media and social media, et cetera, when you realize that the smartphone wasn't even introduced to 2007, that's amazing to me. And it's literally proliferated around the world. Now everyone is a reporter. Everyone can go to their tribe and have the conversation they want to have and be influenced the way they want to be influenced. And sadly, what that does, and certainly the way that social media algorithms work, they work when we're engaged. And when we're engaged, usually it's around something we disagree with. So at the end of the day, social media companies are making money when we disagree. So the more disagreement, the more money they make. That's sad. What we've learned from what Elon Musk has done with X, formerly Twitter, is that he's gone in and opened up the kimono a bit. And he said, look, the algorithms were leaning one way or the other. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to promote free speech. And we're going to put safeguards in place for sure. But at the end of the day, we're going to promote free speech. I think what Elon Musk has done has been very important to the overall conversation. And having been involved in digital media and a former newspaper publisher, I have a deep appreciation for what I'm saying. But the reality is we do live in a polarizing world when most people, Democrats and Republicans, live somewhere in the middle, man. We want problems to be solved. We want the world to quit fighting. We want, the good things to happen. We expect more of our government. And don't you think people would be surprised, Brice, with how many bills passed our state legislature that they actually had bipartisan support? We always hear about the big disagreements. We don't celebrate the agreements, do we?
We don't, but yes, I think that they would be shocked. I've said this in my speaking engagements. I'm anecdotally saying probably 80%, maybe 75 to 80% of the bills we pass are bipartisan in nature. And you don't hear about that. Off the top of my head, two of the absolute biggest pieces of legislation that's passed since I've been there were bipartisan in nature. One is the early education bill that I sponsored, and we are now top 5 in the country in early education. It's part of the Mississippi Miracle. That literally was bipartisan, and there were a portion of the Republican Party who didn't want to do it for various reasons. And the Democrats, it wasn't perfect, and so they wanted to vote against it. But at the end of the day, we came to do it. And then the other one, the flag vote. That was bipartisan with a majority of Republicans leading the legislature. And yes, there were people who didn't do it. That has changed. Those two things alone have changed Mississippi in the last 10 years. I understand people have certain perspectives, but the bottom line is what you're saying is most of the bills that we do, which is let's just call it the nitty gritty, the sausage making, is bipartisan because they send us there to, quote, run the state. And, that means your police officers getting paid. That means your roads being paved. That means your schools, your teachers being funded. But you know what? I'll say this. I think Governor Reeves has said this, and I think it's apt. The media doesn't cover the planes that land every single day. They cover the crashing. But you get millions of planes landing every single day. It's the one crash that gets all the stories.
Yeah, that was when I had the opportunity to work closely with Haley Barbour after Katrina.
Haley? Okay.
Yeah, Haley said that a lot. I'm sure that Governor Reeves says it too, because it's true that media doesn't like planes that land safely. But yeah, we have made a lot of progress. I think the two you cite are great examples, especially the flag, because we can re-debate that, which we will not on this show. The realities of the state flag, is it needed to be changed, and we had a story up on SuperTalk .fm just this past week that said the Mississippi state flag, the new state flag, is the most recognizable state flag in America today. And man, is that important, because this flag before was the most recognizable flag in the United States, which was not a good thing. And then, to study the old state song and the vision that it promoted and its history, it was terrible. And to have a new state song in One Mississippi written by our own Steve Azar, and to have both of those, it really sends a signal about where we're headed as a state, doesn't it?
But Mississippi, it's the bipartisan nature that drives things, I guess. And the reality is we're a small state. I'm going to see people up in the counties north of me, and you have to work together on that. And yes, we are going to have the issues that you get in. There's reasons why you're a Republican and reasons why you're a Democrat. But at the end of the day, the majority are bipartisan. And I do wish people, I think when I talk to my constituents and individuals that I go to church with and all, they appreciate that we are trying to do that. And I think I think that, like you're doing, highlighting more of that and understanding the process, because people don't necessarily understand the process in full.
Yeah, I think that's true for sure. But I think most people can buy into the conversation that we're having now at a high level. A lot of good is happening in our state. It's easy to focus on the things that don't go so well, and we lose sight of what really does go well. Hey, you recently wrote a terrific column, I thought, about conservatism, and it made me think about Haley Barbour and the time when he was working with Ronald Reagan in the White House. And he had the pleasure a couple of times to be in a conversation with Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan after hours as they drank together and broke bread. We can fight. We should fight, and we should debate, and we should do all those things. But at the end of the day, we need to come back together again, and we need to recognize that we're all Mississippians working toward an end. One of the things that you wrote in this piece, you said, teaching young people the founding principles of the GOP, lower taxes, less government, fewer regulations, a strong defense, an even stronger economy, a return to personal responsibility are essential. At the basis of the Republican Party, those are kind of the ideals, and we have a way of losing sight of that, don't we, Brice?
Oh, yes, we do, which is why I wrote that. And there is a debate going on in this state by members really of the Republican Party about what's conservative. And so I wanted to add my voice to it. But what you're reading there was written in part for what I call the younger generation, okay? And because I think what they are seeing, they don't have an accurate view of what's conservatism. And I'll just put it out there, Ricky. I mean, part of what led me to writing it was the tweet that I sent after President Trump was convicted. And which, by the way, since that time, Hunter Biden has been convicted. So we have that. And people, I deemed it the tweet that was heard around the state GOP. Because I think what you're seeing is things that those who have been conservative, and certainly those who understood where Reagan was and is, that's what we considered conservatism. And the things that you read, that was the basis. But as my partner here in the law firm said, the parties were a entity to promote certain ideology, conservative ideology or less than conservative ideology. And it's governed around a set of principles. And to be quite honest, the Republican Party, I think, is in danger of losing those principles, which is why I wrote that. And I have had, since I wrote that, Ricky, I've had so many people come out and young people say, thank you for writing that, because they know what Reagan was about. That was our forefather, if you will. You were living it more so than maybe I was, but we have to get our principles straight. And to be honest, on the national level, there's things that just don't appear to be conservative. And part of this is if your definition of conservatism is to tear down our institutions, that's not conservative. That's why I had Evan Burke in my op-ed, and it was conservatives are, we support the institutions that made us great, our judicial system, our separation of powers. But tearing it all down is not conservatism. It's actually what the extremes want to happen so that they can come into power. Conservatives is, we want to reform, but we love our institutions that made us great. And that's what I was trying to get across.
I love that in your piece you quoted Ronald Reagan, I think even more than once, if I remember right. But in one case about champion freedom, he said, and you quoted him, there can be no freedom without order, and there's no order without virtue. You know, we in this world we're in today, it's gotten so complicated. I don't think that if you really were to quiz people, they can talk on the polarizing issues, but at the core of what conservatives are, or even for that matter, liberals, because I think liberals are going through the same kind of identity crisis, whether our politics should be based on personality or whether it should be based on, as Ronald Reagan said, virtue. And we've kind of lost some of that in our country today, and sadly, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But I tell you what we'll do when we come back on the other side, we'll continue the conversation with Senator Brice Wiggins. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show. We have Senator Brice Wiggins with us today as we come to you celebrating so many wonderful people who are making Mississippi such a great place to live, work, and play from the Citizens Bank studio. When we went to break, though, I was we're just kind of talking about the state of politics today in general. And what we were saying is that both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, there's a bit of a personality confusion that's taking place right now. I think the parties are trying to find themselves. And what I find, if you go and look at some recent research that's been done, the majority of America is somewhere in the middle. Whether they define themselves as a Democrat or a Republican, they're still somewhere in the middle. And as you have so many times pointed out, as we so well know, usually about 3 or 4 states are going to decide who our next president is. That's a sad reality. That's kind of where we are in America, but that's just the way it works. I think that we have got to move away from personality politics and move back to the roots of what made us great. And do you think, though, in this world of populism and polarization that will, and of course the role that social media plays in all of that, do you think we can find our way back to the kind of virtue that Reagan was talking about?
Ricky, for the sake of our party, and when I say our party, the state GOP and the national party, I certainly hope so, because otherwise it's I'm worried. And I give you an example. I was at church on a Sunday, and a gentleman who I know, who's older than me, he's been Republican, donated my campaign, been Republican, and he looked at me, he said, "Thank you, Brice, for what you wrote." He said, "It's getting to the point where I'm not going to vote." And because he's so dejected about that. And he's a conservative. We're conservative. And I think that's the point he was making was, and that's why I wrote that. I felt it on my heart to write that, was to hopefully bring us back, or I don't think we're gone. Okay. I want us to recognize where things may be headed. And to be honest, I believe that that's what leaders should be doing. And for us to recognize that, hold on, we may need to get back to our founding principles. I mean, when I was growing, I graduated high school in 1989. I mean, that was right during the Reagan years as I was growing up. And we know how great Reagan was in terms of communicating to everybody. And it's about, you mentioned one of the quotes I had in there about low tax and personal responsibility. The Republican Party has been about personal responsibility. And, we have to get back to that, we cannot get too far afield from it. And so I just feel like that was one of the reasons I was called to write that, was so that we can say, hey, look, this is where we're headed. Let's steer the ship correctly as we go through this tumultuous situation we're in. But to your point, and I'll finish with this, the stats do show that. Like, that's where the majority of America is, and to be honest, that's where the majority of Mississippi is. But for some reason, that's not what gets talked about, I guess. And I appreciate you being willing to talk about it, because stats are stats, and it is show where people lie on the spectrum.
Hey, listen, the interesting point, coming back to your tweet, maybe heard certainly around Mississippi, maybe heard around the world. What's important about it is that when you said the GOP and Mississippi leadership needs to do some soul searching, I actually would have changed the tweet and just say that GOP leadership in our country needs to do some soul searching. Because I think at the end of the day, I do think that some of the indictments of Trump, specifically, are politically motivated. If you take a step back for a second and just look at the judicial process, there are judicial processes in any given town or city or county or state or even the federal government that at times can be politically motivated. That's why you have the ability to take it. If you don't like the verdict, you can appeal the verdict and you can go to the next step. The process, as it relates to Trump, the wheels of change are turning so slowly. We're all reacting before the process is done finishing. But one of the things that's really important for us to recognize is that the rule of law is an incredibly important part of the American system. And without the rule of law, we would be chaos. I mean, and you quoted Reagan specifically about that. I have to go back over here real quick and remind myself the quote. Oh, here it is right here. The Grand Old Party's conservative beacon is, of course, Ronald Reagan, who said, "For without law, there can be no freedom, only chaos and disorder." And that is more true today than ever, isn't it?
That is so true. Without law, there will be chaos and disorder. And it's the law that allows us to advocate for freedom.
Yeah.
And I know we're coming up on a time, but
yeah,
it is the rule of law is what makes us this country. And as chairman of Judiciary A in the Senate, and as somebody who's dedicated my life, it goes back to what I was saying. We can't destroy that system that's made us great.
Well, hey, listen, we'll pick it up from right there the next time you and I are together. But this has been a terrific conversation, Senator Brice Wiggins. I've enjoyed visiting with you, my friend.
Thank you, Ricky. I appreciate what you do, and keep doing what you're doing.
You bet. Hey, listen, have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.